Imagine a Bible so ambitious, so carefully planned that it reflects the revolution of the High Middle Ages. Today we'll be stepping into the history of the Saint Alban's Bible. It's a very historically significant and important Bible that we'll be looking at today. I have a genuine leaf from one of those Bibles in my collection. So join me in this video as we discuss that and of course enjoy a dramatized story surrounding the very abbey that this particular Bible came from. The wind that night moved like a warning through the narrow streets of Roman Britain, slipping between the wooden homes of the Verulamium, and stirring the small lamps that still burned behind shuttered windows. Most of the town had already withdrawn into uneasy sleep, but the silence did not last long. From the distance came the unmistakable sound of Roman boots striking stone, slow at first, then gathering purpose. The hard rhythm echoing off the walls as soldiers swept through the streets in search of a fugitive. Inside a modest house near the edge of town, a man named Albans stood listening. He was a Roman citizen, a householder, an ordinary man by every outward measure. The troubles of Christians had never been his concern. Rome ruled the world, and men like Alban kept their heads low and their doors closed. But tonight, his door was open. Across the room, illuminated by a soft glow of a single oil lamp, knelt the man the soldiers were hunting. A Christian priest, breath still unsteady from flight, his cloak dusty from the road, yet despite the danger pressing in from every side, the priest's voice remained calm as he spoke quietly of the faith that had brought him to this moment. He spoke of a kingdom not built by Roman hands. He further spoke of a king who had conquered not by the sword, but by surrender and sacrifice. And as the wind pressed against the shutters and the distant footsteps drew nearer, Alban found himself listening more closely than he had intended. At first it was curiosity, but then the uneasiness crept in. But suddenly, something deeper began to take hold. The priest's words were unlike the boasts of Rome or the cold rituals of the old gods. They carried a strange and heavy weight, as though they described a reality more solid than the stone beneath Alban's feet. Outside, the sound of marching continued to grow louder. The priest stopped speaking, and for a long moment the two men simply looked at one another in the flickering lamplight, both understanding what was coming. When Alban finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "You must not be found here." There was no panic in his tone, only decision. Quickly and deliberately, Alban removed his own cloak and placed it around the priest's shoulders. Then, with careful hands, he took the priest's rough garment and pulled it over himself. The exchange was simple, yet effective. But this exchange would change everything. Not long after, the pounding came at the door. It opened to armed soldiers, their armor catching the lamplight as they surged inside. Their eyes fell immediately upon Alban, now dressed in the clothing of the man they sought. They seized him without hesitation. There were questions, accusations, and demands that he renounce the faith he had only just begun to understand. But Alban didn't resist, and more interestingly, did not deny it. Something in that moment had settled in him, quiet and immovable. By morning, he was being led outside the city walls, the cold air sharp against his face as a small crowd gathered at a distance. Tradition later told that even the executioner himself hesitated as he saw the calm on Alban's face. Though the order, once given, could not be withdrawn. The sword was drawn, the wind moved again across the hill, and with a single stroke, the life of the man who had opened his door only hours before came to a sudden end. And in the centuries that followed, Christians would remember Alban as the first recorded martyr of Roman Britain. A great abbey would rise near the place of his death, and pilgrims would travel from far and wide to honor the man who in quiet one night chose courage over safety, all because he listened. And when the truth first came knocking at his door, he had a boldness that was unlike many people. So of course that's a fascinating, interesting story with some very sad endings, of course, with Saint Alban losing his life. This is recorded by the historian Bede, which is a very interesting figure. I'll probably actually talk about him in future videos in more depth. But this story about Saint Alban is a very interesting one. Of course, there's a lot more history and details that could be gone into, but I will discuss him more in future videos since the Alban leaf that I'll be showing in this video is one that I already have another version of. So I will do another video on that one. So of course, subscribe so you don't miss that video. But this Bible leaf is absolutely beautiful and stunning. It's this rather large, not huge, but a reasonably sized leaf. It's got some beautiful artwork on it and some really nice gold leaf. I did just sell this one, so I'll be shipping this out today as of the recording of this video, and the new owner will now have it in their possession. But it is a beautiful item that that guy did purchase off my website. So of course, if you're interested in items like this, be sure to check out my website with the link in the description. But the St. Albans Bible was a large format Latin Vulgate manuscript, which is very typical, very common of Bibles from this time period. Now this one dates to the 14th century, unlike a lot of the items that I've shown up to this point are usually from the 13th century, because the Bibles produced in the 13th century, a lot of them carried over into the 14th century or the 1300s. So Bibles being produced during that time period were a little bit more scarce, at least from a collector's standpoint. It is more difficult and challenging to find Bibles like this one from the 1300s. But Bibles like this were produced in England, potentially in the 13th century, but likely in the 14th century, around 1340 to 1350 or 1360, somewhere within that range. Of course, there's wiggle room within that. It is associated with the great Benedictine Abbey of St. Albans, who I just told that story about, that very interesting character from very early medieval time period in Roman Britain. But what's really interesting about that abbey is that it was one of the most significant and important monastic centers in medieval England. This was a magnificent and important monastery, but again, it was just named after that person in honor of him for his martyrdom, for his faith, albeit short-lived. But this was not a pocket Bible. As you can see, the pocket Bibles were much smaller. I've shown a lot of those in my previous videos that I would encourage you to watch. But this is a much larger Bible, known commonly as a folio Bible. So a very nice, large, and beautiful piece of history. This was a Bible manuscript produced for monastic display. This was beautiful. You got these really long and intricate vinery works there. It's on both sides of the leaf, which is a very nice detail. Again, a lot of the items that I typically show will have most of the artwork just on one side of the leaf versus the opposite side, but this has both sides displayed with beautiful artwork on it, which actually makes it a little bit challenging from a display standpoint, especially the way I display my items. With them being in these frames, you have to sometimes rotate it back and forth, so I'll do that occasionally with my items to see the verso side of the leaf, or the one that doesn't have maybe as intricate of artwork on there. But there are many key scholarly characteristics about this particular Bible. The first is that it's the Latin Vulgate text, which I mentioned before. The Gothic textualis script, very indicative of that time period, especially in the 12 and 1300s. You got the large folio format, which I discussed already, and it is a great example of English illumination that we see from early England. A very nice and beautiful Bible, and in excellent condition. There's some staining around the edges, but by and large, this is a very good condition manuscript. Now, the historical context for this is actually very important. To understand this Bible, we have to understand the 13th or 14th century England. This is the age of expanding universities, growing in book production and standardization of biblical texts that we see throughout history. The rise of professional scribal workshops all throughout the land. We see this big uptick in Bible production during this time. So it's very important, very significant, and really fascinating. It's something that I enjoy studying, and it's why I do this channel, so I can help educate people and teach people about the history of these Bibles, not just from an archaeological perspective or a textual criticism perspective, but from a historical aspect, showing God's word being transmitted and copied throughout the centuries, and who copied it and why and where and how it's been preserved for so long. It's one of the more fascinating aspects of collecting. It's something that I really enjoy. It's actually one of the reasons that I did my video on the Dead Sea Scrolls, to show how the Bible holds up to other historical figures and manuscripts, and the evidence that we have for the Bible is abundant and very, very important. Nevertheless, Paris was producing small pocket Bibles for students. That was their niche. They were something very good at that, although they produced many large Bibles as well, but a lot of them are those small pocket Bibles. But we see here happening in English houses, like the Saint Alban's Bible, were still being produced in grand institutional manuscripts, which we can see on this one with the beautiful gold leaf that just glistens in the right light. It's absolutely beautiful and stunning. But St. Alban's Abbey itself was famous for its historical writing tradition, its wealthy patronage, and its sophisticated scriptorium culture. The Bible reflects the world of monastic learning meeting emerging commercial book production. So we see this really interesting contrast between Bibles that were produced primarily for an intellectual or pedagogical type setting versus commercial use for people who could afford it to buy items like this. Very important and very significant in that regard. The script features are very common Gothic textualis. I've talked about that in a lot of my other videos, so I'm not going to expound upon it too much in this one since, again, I've mentioned it in previous videos. Now, the St. Alban's Bible sits at a transitional moment in book history. It shows us the movement from purely monastic copying towards more systematized, large-scale manuscript production. But still, before the full dominance of Paris pocket Bibles in England, it also reflects the continued prestige of large-format monastic Bibles, the intellectual seriousness of English Benedictine houses, the regional variation of Gothic book production, and for manuscript scholars, it helps answer a key question. How did English Bible production adapt during the Paris Bible Revolution? So we see these two major hubs of Bible production. It's still within Europe, but you have Paris and then you have England, and these two countries are producing their Bibles, and it's really interesting to compare and contrast them. And actually can be very difficult and very challenging. I have another Bible that was produced in Italy, so yet another one, but they all tend to look very similar. So having to compare and contrast them, it can be very challenging and difficult, but it is nonetheless a valiant and important effort. So I've absolutely enjoyed doing that and love talking about it. And of course, if you find content like this interesting, I would encourage you and ask that you would subscribe and check out the other videos. I put a lot of time and work into these. I try to make them enjoyable and interesting. Some videos are more historically in depth, whereas other ones like this one are kind of just a glossary, an overview of the Bible. So the St. Alban's Bible, again, a ton of history about it, but I will go into that in more detail on a future video because I have another leaf just like this from another passage. Now, I don't know if I actually mentioned the passage in the beginning part of the video, but this comes from the book of Ezekiel, I believe chapters 21 through 24, somewhere in that range. But it's a very important and interesting passage, great history behind it, beautiful leaf. I'm really glad that the buyer of this is going to be able to add it to their own collection. He's a good friend of mine. He's overseas, but he is a very passionate collector, and I really appreciate his business and his support, and I'm glad that this will be going into good hands. When I sell these things, I always hope that it'll go to someone who will love it, care for it, and enjoy it as much as I do. So I'm glad that it will be going to that kind of situation in a few days here. So if you find this content interesting, again, subscribe. I appreciate you guys sticking it out to the full video. Check out those close-up shots at the end of this amazing, gorgeous manuscript. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.